All right, for station number 1, we're going to look at the sex chromosomes to determine if it's male or female. So those are the chromosomes that are very last, and for this particular individual karyotype, we do have an X and a Y, so that would make this a male. Are there any problems? There definitely are. There are only 20 pairs of chromosomes here. This individual, if this is human, would not even develop. You need to have 23 pairs. So if you count through, you can see there are only 19 autosomal chromosomes, and there is just one, there's the pair of sex chromosomes. So there are not enough pairs of chromosomes here. How many autosomes does this individual have? Because there are only 19 times 2 for each would be 38 autosomes. 22 should have 44 of them. On station number 2, there is an issue with this karyotype. If we look down at the sex chromosomes, we can see that there is only one X chromosome. So that means that this is a female with an issue that is called Turner syndrome, where they only have one X chromosome instead of having two X chromosomes. So when we write this kind of mistake, we would write that this is a female with a missing X chromosome to identify this mistake. In this next karyotype, if you take a look at the autosomes and look at pair number 18, you will see that there are 3 chromosomes there instead of just a pair. So we can see that this would be a trisomy 18. This is a male with trisomy 18. For question number 9, we cannot see individual gene disorders in a karyotype. We can only see if there is an extra chromosome, a missing chromosome, or we can also see if there is a broken chromosome or a piece of an entire chromosome missing. Number 10, true or false, a genetic counselor can use a pedigree to identify a carrier of an autosomal recessive gene disorder. Usually genetic counselors can create family pedigrees if we have enough information, and then you can work your way through that pedigree to try to find carriers of recessive gene disorders. That is one of the jobs of a genetic counselor. This right here is called a pedigree. So we're going to focus on really understanding and reading these pedigrees. So number 11, this is a pedigree. Number 12, is this autosomal or sex-linked? So 14 asks for what are the clues. So how do I figure out the answers to number 12 and 13? Well, to figure out if something is sex-linked, you should see, is the trait being shown predominantly in one sex over the other? And we can see that in generation number 1, we can see only the male is having the disorder. And then if we move on to generation 3 and generation 4, we can see again that it is only males that have the disorder. So that is first a clue that this is a sex-linked disorder because of the fact that we don't have any females with the disorder. The next, number 13, is this dominant or recessive. What we want to look at is we want to see, are we seeing the trait in every single generation? Since we see the trait skip a generation, then that's an indicator for us that the trait is probably being covered up by the dominant allele. For example, mom is going to give a dominant allele to each of the children, and even if she's a carrier, there's a chance that she will not give that recessive allele. And so even though dad has the disorder, we can see that him passing it on to the females, mom will cover up the disorder. Passing on to the males, again, mom is only going to pass the X, so dad is passing the Y, and if dad passes the Y, then those sons are not going to have the disorder. So there's a really big clue here that this is recessive because it skips a generation. Now, if we look at this next pedigree and kind of compare it to the last pedigree, we can see that we have an almost equal number of males and females that are afflicted with the disorder. And so that's an indicator to us that this is not going to be a sex-linked disorder like our previous one. We also can see that it is affecting every single generation. So we can also infer that this is probably could be a dominant trait. And if we look at the first generation with dad having the disorder, we can see that dad is always passing that dominant gene. If we look at dad, if this is a dominant trait, perhaps dad has one dominant and one recessive, and mom has two recessive, and so we can make a prediction about what child number 3 has as their genetics, and how did they not get this disorder if it's dominant. So some of the things we want to look at on here is we try to make predictions. If something is shaded, then that means that they have the disorder, and we can tell that that problem exists every generation. If we see it every generation, then we can try to figure out, is it a dominant or recessive? And we can use genes to try to determine the genotype of each individual in that pedigree. Number 17, how can you tell the difference between a chromosomal disorder and a gene disorder? Well, chromosomal disorders usually cause really big problems, an extra chromosome or a missing chromosome. Gene disorders are smaller mistakes that we actually have to look at individual chromosomes and see where the gene mistake might be. And one of the big differences there is the different types of disorders that we have and what kind of syndromes they have and symptoms. In this pedigree, we can see something a little bit different. We see some half-shaded circles. These half-shaded circles are indicators that these are carriers. Anytime you are a carrier, that means that you are carrying the gene, but you are not displaying the disorder. That also then is going to be an indication that it is a recessive disorder, because remember that if you are a carrier, you have the recessive gene, but you have a dominant gene to cover it up, and therefore you're not displaying the disorder. So we can look at the genotype for the first generation parents. We can see the dad is not having the disorder, so that means that he's going to have 2 of the dominant alleles, and then mom has the disorder, which means could have a dominant and a recessive. Now, we've got to figure out, well, is this a recessive problem or is this a dominant problem? So again, if we look at dad and we say that dad has 2 dominants and does not have the problem, and mom has a dominant and a recessive, we have to look down at the son that has the disorder and determine, is there a way that he could have gotten this disorder? If there's not, then we have to determine if there is then instead, perhaps this is a recessive disorder and dad is covering up the recessive and he's not being indicated as a carrier. So we kind of have to make some predictions. We kind of have to figure out what could the different genetic traits be. We'll also have to determine, well, is this sex linked? And if it's sex linked, we're not going to have very many females who have the disorder. So that's another thing. I can see here that only my males have the disorder. So that's a clue to me. This is a sex linked disorder. So the reason the dad does not have this disorder is because his X chromosome has the dominant allele. But remember, it is the dad, the male, who determines what the gender is going to be. So when dad's sperm was made, then that means that the sperm he gave his son, or the genetics he gave his son and his sperm had to have the Y. So how did the son in this first generation get the disorder? Well, mom is a carrier, and that is how he got the disorder. So again, we have to look and see, do we have a lot of males and no females afflicted with the disorder? That's a clue to us that this is going to be a sex-linked genetic disorder.